At 6:43 a.m. on February 12, 1944, Corporal Thomas Grady crouched beside a collapsed stone wall on the lower slopes of Monte Cassino. The rain had turned the hillside into a sheet of gray mud. His boots sank half an inch every time he shifted his weight. Overhead, the roar of outgoing artillery rolled through the valley like thunder. Grady wiped the water from his binoculars, trying to see the monastery that lay hidden inside the clouds. He could not. The target markers had vanished in the mist, and somewhere beyond that fog American shells were already falling short. He heard the impact, dull and close, followed by a scream that cut through the rain. He pressed his face into the mud, waiting for the echo to fade. The smell of wet earth mixed with cordite and diesel. Down the slope, stretcher teams were already running. Grady knew what had happened. The guns had been off by less than 50 yards, maybe only a few degrees in bearing. But that was enough. He looked at the folded map in his hand. The grid lines were smudged by rainwater, the ink bleeding into the paper. Somewhere in those lines was the error that kept killing his Rome itself. Every American attempt to climb the slope had been met with fire that seemed impossibly accurate. Yet when the Allied guns tried to answer, their shells fell wide, short, or too far left. The map said the ridge line rose 600 feet above the valley. In truth, it rose almost 900. The difference came from centuries of terraces, collapsed walls, and rubble that no one had ever surveyed. The artillery tables did not account for it. The sighting instruments assumed a flat grid, a perfect geometry that did not exist in Italy's broken hills. Each time Grady called in coordinates, he could feel the hesitation in the voice that repeated them back from the fire direction center. They trusted the numbers, not the eyes of a corporal sitting in the mud. And when the rounds fell wrong, the answer was always the same phrase from the manual, within acceptable deviation. He watched another barrage splash against the hillside 200 yards short of the enemy line. Shrapnel tore through an olive grove where American infantry had taken cover. Grady slammed his fist into the wet ground. The instruments were precise, but the reality was not. The earth itself was betraying them, bending the math that kept men alive. By the third week of the Cassino campaign, Thomas Grady had stopped counting the bodies. Every correction he sent to the guns felt like a gamble played with lives he could still hear over the radio. The first mistake came on February 16th. A forward rifle platoon asked for covering fire before crossing a creek bed. Grady gave the coordinates, triple-checked them, and watched the shells land on their own line. 8 men gone in the first minute. The next day, a British battery tried to hit a German mortar nest behind a stone barn. The round hit the barn's front wall instead, killing the infantry who had just taken shelter there. The official report listed fog interference. Grady listed it in his head as another error of geometry. By the end of the month, 14 men were dead from short rounds. 6 more had been wounded so badly that stretcher teams carried of iron and rain. Grady knew half their names. He had eaten beside them the week before, shared cigarettes under broken trees. Every new mistake drew the same phrase from the staff tent: within tolerance. But tolerance was a word for engineers and mapmakers, not for the men whose bodies were being loaded into canvas bags. Grady began to hate the sound of the field telephone. Every time it rang, it meant another correction, another burst of fire that might miss by only a few feet, and that was enough to end a life. At night, when the guns finally went silent, he lay awake listening to the rain, tracing imaginary lines in the air with his finger, trying to understand why their math failed where the mountain began. One gray afternoon, as the valley filled again with drizzle, Grady crouched near a shallow trench where the last barrage had torn the hillside apart. Water trickled down through the craters, cutting small veins into the earth. He watched those thin streams snake downward, each one following its own path around the rocks. That was when he noticed it. The lines of flow were nothing like the smooth curves printed on his map. Surveyors had never recorded. The guns were firing according to a flat illusion. The shells flew exactly as ordered. It was the earth that refused to obey. He dragged the edge of a stick through the mud, copying what he saw. A small ridge here, a shallow depression there. He pushed a few pebbles to mark the known gun positions, then scratched new arcs to represent how the ground truly curved. Between them, for the first time, the mountain began to make sense. The next time a round landed short, Grady compared the impact point with his crude drawing. The error matched his mud sketch perfectly. The realization hit him like recoil. The problem was not the gunners, not the math. It was the perspective itself. They were fighting a three-dimensional battle with two-dimensional maps. He stared at his hands, streaked with mud and rainwater, and felt the strange certainty that he was holding the key to stop the killing. But no one would believe a corporal who drew maps in the dirt. That evening Grady carried his mud-stained notebook to the command tent. The rain drummed on the canvas roof like machine gun fire. A captain leaned over a map table lit by a single lantern, red light washing across stacks of wet paper. Grady laid down his sketch, still damp from the hillside. He tried to explain the difference between what the map showed and what he had seen. The captain frowned. "The contour intervals are verified by the Royal Engineers," he said. "The artillery tables are calibrated from London. Everything is within specification." Grady pointed to the mud lines, traced the slope with his finger, described how the elevation dropped faster than the printed gradient. The captain's patience thinned. "We don't redraw topography, Corporal. We fight with what we have." Over the next week, Grady tried again, speaking to a lieutenant at the Fire Direction Center. The answer was colder. "We can't alter firing data without authorization." The manuals were law, and every man who followed them could prove he had done his duty. But duty did not stop the short rounds. Every night, as new casualties came down from the ridge, the reports still said pilot error of map reading. The phrase gnawed at him. He began to realize the truth that no one would say aloud. The system wasn't built to see the ground. It was built to preserve itself. The maps could be wrong. The shells could be wrong. But as long as the paperwork was correct, no one could be blamed. Grady returned to his post, the mud sucking at his boots, the rain endless. Around him, the valley kept echoing with the same dull rhythm of misplaced shells. And he understood that if anything was going to change, it would have to be done in secret. The night of March 1st was cold and heavy with mist. Grady waited until the guns went silent, until the officers retreated to their tents, and the valley fell into that uneasy hush before dawn. Then he slipped out of his post, carrying nothing but a flashlight, a ruler, and a stick he had cut from an olive tree. He climbed halfway up the slope, boots sliding in the mud, until he reached a ledge that overlooked both the American and German lines. The fog hung low, hiding the monastery above, but muffling every sound. There, on a patch of bare ground between shell craters, Grady began to work. He drew the valley again. In the mud, this time not as a map, but as it truly looked from where he stood. He marked the river with a groove, traced the angles of fire from each known gun pit, then pressed pebbles to mark the suspected German positions that scouts had whispered about. His fingers were numb from cold, the flashlight dimmed by rain, but he kept going. Then he did what no manual ever allowed. He changed the coordinates. He shifted the elevation numbers by what his eyes told him, not what the grid claimed. It was only a few degrees of adjustment, but it meant the shells would arc higher, travel a fraction longer before descending. At dawn, he called the correction in through the field phone, disguising it as a minor recalibration due to humidity. The gunners confirmed. Minutes later, the first round screamed overhead and detonated against the monastery wall, not the valley floor. The radio came alive with shouting. The target had been hit, exactly hit, on the first bracket. Grady stared through his binoculars, heart hammering. Smoke rose from the enemy line, not his own. For the first time in weeks, the coordinates had matched reality. He wiped the mud from his hands, shaking. The act was illegal, dangerous, unforgivable. But it had worked. The confirmation came the next morning. At 0700 hours, the infantry advanced under the new fire plan. The guns thundered in rhythm, shells bursting precisely along the ridge ahead of them. For once the valley stayed clear of friendly fire smoke. The radiomen in Grady's unit listened in disbelief as the forward platoons reported progress without casualties. From his observation post, Grady could see the pattern with his own eyes. Each impact fell exactly where it was meant to, walking across the slope in perfect sequence. The German machine gun nests that had pinned them for 2 weeks were gone in minutes. One lieutenant called it the cleanest barrage he had ever seen. When the firing ceased, the air was still. The rain had stopped, leaving the mountain shining under a pale winter sun. For the first time since the campaign began, silence did not mean loss. It meant success. Grady sat in the mud, exhausted, the field phone still buzzing with excited voices. Someone shouted that the correction grid from the night before would be used for the entire sector. The staff officers thought it was a weather adjustment that had finally worked. No one suspected that a corporal had rewritten the math with a stick and a patch of mud. He looked at his hands, cracked and caked with dried clay, and felt something close to relief. The war had not changed, but the hill had. And for the first time, the ground itself seemed to listen. Within a week, the pattern began to repeat itself. Other observers noticed that the new firing tables from Grady's sector performed better than any previous set. The shells landed tighter, the corrections shorter, the casualties fewer. No one could explain why. They only knew that the coordinates marked with a faint pencil note, adjusted for terrain curvature, never missed. Grady said nothing. He simply handed out copies of his sketch when other units passed through the valley. Some of them redrew the lines, added their own markings, then folded the pages into field notebooks. What had begun as one man's guess in the mud became a whisper that spread from gun crew to gun crew. By late March, observers across the Fifth Army were using variations of what soldiers began calling the mud map. No document mentioned its origin. The name of Corporal Thomas Grady appeared nowhere. But the data spoke for itself. The hit ratio climbed. The reports from forward patrols grew shorter. Commanders began to talk about a new intuition among their observers, an uncanny accuracy under fog and rain. During inspections, the officers attributed the improvement to better morale. Better weather, better everything except what it truly was. The mud lines had turned into quiet doctrine. At night, when Grady walked past the gun pits, he would sometimes see young observers, kneeling in the dirt, drawing their own tiny valleys with twigs before a mission. He never corrected them. He only watched and smiled, knowing that the earth itself was now teaching them how to aim. By April, the German reports began to change in tone. Captured documents spoke of American artillery that now struck with unnatural precision, even in fog so dense that aircraft could not fly. Wehrmacht observers along the Cassino front wrote that Allied shells were landing within meters of their concealed emplacements, sometimes after only a single ranging round. They assumed the Americans had acquired new optical equipment or were being guided by aircraft hidden in the clouds. In truth, nothing new had arrived. The same guns, the same crews, the same rusted sights, all still there. The only difference lay in the way those crews read the earth beneath them. German counter-battery units tried to respond, but their estimates were always late. The terrain they believed safe had somehow turned hostile. Camouflaged gun pits that had survived months of shelling were suddenly erased in a single salvo. Officers demanded explanations from their map divisions, convinced the Allies had cracked some mathematical code. They were half right. The code was the mountain itself, translated by a corporal's muddy hands. Prisoners captured later told Allied interrogators that their commanders no longer trusted the high ground. They had begun moving equipment at night, afraid to stay fixed in one position for more than a day. It was not fear of the guns, it was fear of the accuracy. Grady listened to those reports in silence. No one mentioned his name, and that was fine. What mattered was the sudden shift he could feel across the line. The enemy had lost confidence in the terrain they once ruled. When the battle for Monte Cassino finally ended, the paperwork that followed was as thick as the fog had once been. Reports spoke of improved artillery efficiency, of revised procedures, of new map-reading discipline among the forward observers. There was a citation for a captain who had implemented corrective terrain adjustments, though the man had never left his tent. Corporal Thomas Grady's name appeared only once, on a routine transfer order to a supply unit near Naples. No one asked him how he had done it. No one even knew there was something to ask about. His sketchbook stayed in his pack, pages stiff with dried mud. When his rotation ended, he turned it in with his kit, and it vanished into the warehouse of forgotten things that every war leaves behind. Back home, Grady returned to his old job as a surveyor's assistant in Ohio. He never spoke about Cassino. Sometimes, when rain filled the ruts along the roadside, he would pause to watch the water trace its own lines down the slope. The sight still gave him the same quiet certainty that truth was hidden in small details. He never received a medal, never even a letter of commendation. The Army had no award for a man who redrew the world in the dirt. His war ended with silence, and he carried it easily. The guns had stopped. That was enough. 30 years later, an artillery officer named Major William Prescott wrote a paper for a military journal about a long-forgotten innovation during the Italian campaign. In one paragraph, he mentioned an unnamed corporal who had developed what he called terrain correction mapping, a field method for adjusting fire by visual contour. The technique, Prescott noted, had quietly influenced the standardized grid correction system adopted by NATO decades later. No records identified that corporal. The archives listed only a series of anonymous field sketches filed under experimental observations, 5th Army, February to March, 1944. One of those sketches, preserved under glass, still bore faint fingerprints pressed into dried mud. In a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, Thomas Grady died in 1972, working on a drainage survey near a highway expansion. The local newspaper printed a 3-line obituary. It mentioned he was a veteran of the Italian campaign and a father of 2. Nothing else. But among the engineers who later studied the NATO firing tables, one quietly added a note in the margin of his lecture slides, derived from field adjustments, Monte Cassino, Corporal Grady, U.S. Army. He never knew that line existed, yet it captured the truth of his life, that history often moves forward not through orders or generals, but through the hands of one man who refused to let the map lie. And somewhere, under another gray sky, the rain still draws lines in the mud, just as he once did, teaching new soldiers how to see the ground for what it truly is.